Putin is living in fear. You may not realize it as Russia's leader tries desperately to project power to the world, but he knows that the Ukraine war is lost. And he also realizes that something destructive and inevitable is closing in. But here's the kicker, that something isn't Ukraine. Putin is now more scared of his own people and perhaps his own army than he is of the war he started. The most bizarre war is about to begin as Putin is preparing to fight Russia itself. As crazy a concept as that may sound, there are plenty of signs that Putin is preparing for more war inside Russia than he is attempting to win the war in Ukraine. We'll be exploring those signs throughout the video, so make sure you stick with us until the end. But the biggest signal that Putin is losing himself to his own paranoia and his desire to maintain his grasp on leadership in any way that he can comes from what is happening with the Rosgvardia right now. The Rosgvardia is growing in size and power, and this is a sign of Putin's weakness. To understand why, you need to know a little about what the Rosgvardia actually is. This organization is the National Guard of Russia, and it's the largest internal security force the country and, more importantly, Putin has. It was Putin himself who formed this unit back in 2016, and the group already has a vast remit and significant resources, long before the latest change that Putin has instituted. Think of the Rosgvardia as being similar to Adolf Hitler's Schutzstaffel or SS. Both the Rosgvardia and SS amount to protection squads designed to guard their leader. They serve as bodyguards and do all of the dirty work that needs doing inside their own country. While the military fights abroad, the Rosgvardia and, in the past, the SS work to maintain security at home, which in turn protects the position of the leader who formed them. We saw how that worked out for Hitler during the 1940s, and Putin's recent changes to the Rosgvardia, showing that he is growing as paranoid as the Nazi leader as he tries to maintain his grip on power. That's according to Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, William James Dixon. On February 20th, the Kyiv Post reported that Putin is currently hard at work building the Rosgvardia into a parallel structure that Putin can command both on the Ukraine battlefield and use to guard himself against the threats from within Russia itself. The latter was always the Rosgvardia's task in many ways. What we're seeing now is the further development of that group into what can only be deemed as Putin's personal army. The Rosgvardia now operates outside the scope of Russia's defense ministry, essentially making it more powerful from a decision-making standpoint than the very organization that is overseeing Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And thanks to a recent Kremlin decree, spearheaded by Putin himself, the Rosgvardia is being elevated to the point where its director, Viktor Zolotov, will only ever have to answer to Putin himself. But why do this? Why would Putin create an army of his own when Russia's military is fighting and dying in enormous numbers in Ukraine? We just gave you the answer by asking the question. Putin knows that this war has been disastrous for his country in ways that we're going to explain later in the video. And now, as Dixon explains, there has been a shift in Putin's mindset. Russia's president knows that he has lost the war that he started. Yes, the fighting is ongoing and Russia is making slow progress, so slow that we haven't seen anything as crawlingly sluggish since World War I, but progress nonetheless. However, that was supposed to be Russia's version of a blitzkrieg devolved into a years-long fight that shows no signs of ending, and Putin knows that his people are weary. That support is waning for the invasion, and according to Dixon, the strengthening of the Rosgvardia is a sign that Putin is now trying to insulate himself from public unrest and anger from the elites. The Rosgvardia today is not what it was when Putin formed it. Rather than being an internal policing structure, Dixon notes, it has become something akin to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a Praetorian force that exists to protect the regime and, in the case of Putin's so-called National Guard, is now forming specialized units that include tank formations. This is not what a leader uses for internal security. It's what they build when they know the consequences of their actions are incoming, and they need to do whatever they can to maintain control. And Putin knows that the consequences are coming. All of the pressure that Russia now faces, from the failure of the Ukraine invasion through to the intense economic pressure placed on the country by sanctions, is now coming to a head. Questions are being asked about the fragility of Putin's regime, perhaps for the first time since he came to power. Diverging opinions, though certainly not loud enough to destroy Putin, are being expressed, especially on the subject of the economy. The globalist argues that a split is forming between Putin and many of the elites that he himself put into power. They may pretend to support this war in Ukraine and are happy to profit from it, but they desperately want the hostilities to end, the globalist says, as their main interest in making more money conflicts with Putin's nationalistic and egotistical goals of turning Russia, and by extension himself, into one of the world's foremost powers. Putin can feel this shift in support. He knows that it's coming. And so what we're seeing with the Rosgvardia is a sign that Putin's paranoia about what comes next, whether that's after the war or in the months and years that the war continues to wage with no conclusion, has gotten the best of him. Simply creating a national security force into a military power inside Russia is a strong enough signal that Putin is getting worried. The fact that the Rosgvardia operates outside of the Russian Defense Ministry is enough to create problems. As Dixon puts it, the Rosgvardia is now a flashpoint for further division, which will make succession more difficult and ultimately tries to center all of Russia's power on one man who, at 73 years old, likely doesn't have long left to maintain that power. What Putin has done is create a situation where multiple power centers will grapple over the Russian reins long after he is gone. Putin himself has raised the subject of succession before. Back in May 2025, the New Voice of Ukraine reported on a Russian documentary entitled Russia, Kremlin, Putin, 25 Years. Putin himself is filmed claiming that a person must emerge, or better yet several, so people have a choice, who could earn the trust of the country's citizens. Putting aside how ridiculous that statement is for an autocrat verging on a dictator to make, what we see here is simply put, a lie. Putin doesn't care about succession. Putin cares about Putin. And the strengthening of the Rosgvardia is one of the signs that Putin is utterly willing to relinquish his grip on power, even as that grip falters. Putin is preparing for a fight. Or more accurately, he's attempting to protect himself from the inevitability of the breakdown of the regime that he has spent a quarter of a century developing. We'll be getting deeper into that and other signs of Putin's fear of the destructive force that is closing in around him in a moment. But before we do, if this is the kind of insight that you want more of, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. Now the Putin regime. What are we really seeing with the strengthening of the Rosgvardia? According to noted military analyst and YouTube creator Paul Warburg, this, along with other signs that we're about to cover, is a symptom of the breakdown of an entire regime. This is Putin putting steps in place to control the internal Russian narrative as he tries to maintain the image of himself as the strong man of Russian politics, even as his Ukraine invasion crumbles around him. And all we need to do is look at the past to see what's happening in Putin's paranoid present. When we look at the history in the twilight days of authoritarian regimes, it's very often the case that those regimes seem the strongest that they ever have, and their words sound more confident than they did at the beginning, Warburg says of what we're seeing with Putin now. But this strength is a smokescreen, an illusion cast by a failing dictator who knows that his grip on power is faltering, and his weaknesses have been exposed not just to the world, but to the people inside his own country that he's trying to control. Don't look at the words, Warburg explains, look at the actions. And right now there are a lot of actions that Putin is taking that are surefire signs that the regime he created is collapsing. The attempt to strengthen a supposed national security force into what amounts to a military unit controlled solely by Putin is just one of those signs. Another comes from what we're seeing in the peace talks right now. Ever since US President Donald Trump started to force an end to the Ukraine war by starting peace talks in early 2025, we have seen Putin play the same game. He talks about wanting peace while doing things that indicate that he has no intention of ending the war that he started. In other words, Putin does what Warburg says, talks a big game while taking actions that prove he intends to do the opposite of what he says. Even as recently as February 19th, in the wake of yet another round of peace talks, The Guardian reported on comments made by both Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and the European Union or EU. Zelensky once again accused Putin of using delay tactics to stall negotiations, as Putin will not shift on his maximalist demands that Ukraine must cede territory to gain peace. As for the EU, the bloc's foreign affairs spokesperson Anwar El-Anouni put it simply, stating, "We see that Russia continues its relentless attacks on Ukraine. This does reflect that Russia is not ready for peace. We still do not see tangible signs that Russia is engaging seriously on peace." Warburg says that Russia isn't even trying to pretend that it's interested in peace anymore. What we're really seeing here is what Warburg pointed to earlier. Putin is trying to be strong with his words, with his claims that Ukraine has to give up territory precisely because he knows that the collapse of his regime is closer than ever before. Putin can't afford to stop in Ukraine because he knows that a fight is bubbling up at home, so he's doing everything that he can to delay the inevitable. We'll explain why Putin is so paranoid about the upcoming fight against Russia itself toward the end of the video, so keep watching to learn more. However, for now, Putin's proclamations of strength in peace negotiations aren't being matched by the actions he's taking in Russia itself. The Rosgvardia is being strengthened because Putin needs a tangible force that he can use to control the narrative around himself, if and when Russia's people or its returning soldiers rebel. However, Putin has taken a more direct step that makes it clear to everybody in Russia that he is desperate to control the message that surrounds the Kremlin. A mass media crackdown is underway in Russia, and it's all being designed to placate Putin's paranoia. Simultaneously, though, while Russia does this with their words and acts strong with their words, Warburg says of Putin's refusal to seriously engage in peace talks, Russia is having the biggest media crackdown in Russian history. We haven't seen anything like this since the Soviet era, and it's a crackdown that is so comprehensive that it would actually make Joseph Stalin excited, Warburg says. Over the past couple of weeks, Putin has throttled Russian access to both WhatsApp and Telegram. The latter in particular is painful for the average Russian and the soldiers on the Ukraine war front lines. For average Russians, they lose access to an open communication platform that is used by a huge portion of the country, including about 85% of Russians aged 12 to 24. That's a pretty large segment of the younger Russian population that is losing access to news that comes from sources other than those approved by the Kremlin. And that's the point for Putin. He doesn't want anybody in Russia getting any big ideas about overthrowing him, especially not the younger people who have the potential, no matter how far-flung it might seem, to organize into a fighting force while they're in their physical prime. On February 20th, Putin took things another step further. Russia's president chose that date to sign a new law that obliges Russia's telecommunications operators to disconnect communications if required to do so by the Federal Security Service, or FSB. Operators will have to cut access to the internet for people in regions where Russia is experiencing terrorist threats, which roughly translates to Putin wanting to make sure that there is no way for anybody in Russia to actually communicate with the outside world when Ukraine attacks an oil refinery or military facility. It's all about controlling the narrative. And in Putin's desperation, we're seeing the death throes of a leader who knows time is short. For as damaging as all of this is to Russia's people, Putin's shutdown of communication services, especially Telegram, basically sees Putin sabotage his own military. TVP World reports that the Kremlin crackdown on Telegram has prompted a backlash from many in Russia. For the military, the loss of the app also amounts to losing a key platform that allowed soldiers to organize assaults and communicate on the front lines. What Telegram did is it allowed Russian soldiers to share pictures and videos with each other extremely quickly so that they could be responsive on the battlefield, Warburg explains. That was vital for Russia's drone operators, as it allowed for quick identification of targets. Elsewhere on the front, Russia's soldiers would have been using Telegram to document Ukraine's fortifications and organize assaults against Ukrainian positions. All of that is now gone. It's no coincidence that Putin is buffing up his internal security force at around the same time that he's sabotaging his own army. And make no mistake about it, Putin knows precisely what he's doing to the Russian military by stamping down on Telegram. When you see an authoritarian country starting to sabotage their military effectiveness to better control the narrative at home, that shows a shift in that particular dictator's thinking, Warburg explains. Dixon said the same when referring to the strengthening of the Rosgvardia, and it all comes down to Putin now being more concerned with information control than he is with winning the war. The invasion of Ukraine is just something that Putin is keeping chugging along so that he can avoid the inevitable. The war that he faces now that his power of patronage has collapsed. Dictators like Putin stay in power not because they have the support of their people, but because they create what Engelsberg Ideas calls the people of the dictator. This is almost always a minority of people, accounting for between 2 and 20% of a country's population. But that's enough for a dictator to maintain control. For instance, Putin has previously controlled the Russian military because he would personally offer promotions. He would enable the corruption that allowed officers and head honchos to make money. Any form of public service becomes a gift from the dictator, Engelsberg Ideas says. And that arrangement can only last as long as there is money and power to distribute to the people the dictator wants to control. Putin is running out of both. He knows it, and that's why he's trying hard to control the internal narrative now inside Russia. Putin understands that he's created a horrorscape for Russia, both in terms of the country's position right now and what it faces in the future. Whatever grand schemes that Putin had for victory in Ukraine have long ago crumbled. Putin absolutely isn't going to become the modern-day equivalent of the great Tsars of Russia, because all he's done in Ukraine is prove his own inadequacy, even if Russia eventually wins. That victory, assuming it ever comes, has already taken out far more from Russia than anybody ever anticipated. It's that fact, combined with Putin having no idea of what to do with a returning army of hundreds of thousands of brutalized soldiers, that leads to everything that we see now. Putin knows that a war to maintain power in his own country is coming, so shutting down communications and building his own private army is really all about protecting himself from the possibility that Russia's people and perhaps even its military will revolt. Rand makes that point in a February 20th article by John Teft, who outlines the many problems that Putin has created in Russia. The country has a declining population that isn't being aided by the war. According to the UN, Russia will have between 74 and 112 million people in 2100, down from the 146 million it has today. Independent civil society and opposition political activity are already being suppressed radically in Russia, Teft points out. And Putin still has no solution for the problem of the returning soldiers. About 8,000 of Russia's returning veterans have already been convicted of civil crimes since they came back home, Teft points out, and around 900 have committed violent crimes, resulting in the deaths of at least 423 people. This is a microcosm of what Putin believes he may have to face in a future where his war has crippled Russia more than it already has. Imagine hundreds of thousands of angry soldiers coming back home to a country that is on its knees and is even more authoritarian than it was when they left. You get a powder keg, a situation in which the soldiers and the people realize that the war that Putin has waged was for nothing in terms of improving their lot in life. That anger is the core ingredient for a civil war breaking out. A war in which the people that Putin wants to control rise up against him, and as much as Putin tries to guard against this type of societal upheaval, he is simply following the handbook that all dictators follow before their collapse. More control, more suppression, sabotage against a military that has already lost almost 1.26 million people to war in Ukraine. For Putin, holding power over a ruined country is better than moving out of the way for a better tomorrow. The Rosgvardia getting stronger is a signal that Putin has shifted his focus to his new enemy. That enemy isn't Ukraine, it's Russia itself. And Russia will have to rise up against Putin because a century of destruction lies in its future if it doesn't. The country's entire future hangs in the balance as Russia bleeds out soldiers and is facing up to a demographic crisis that will haunt the country, all because of Putin. Find out more in our video, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more insight into paranoid Putin's desperate attempts to maintain power. And thank you, as always, for watching.